What if I told you that the Biden administration is close to declaring a climate emergency that would ration your gas, your electricity, and your meat? We're going to be talking about this. Also, did we really experience the hottest days ever this July 4th? I've got emails that show the Biden administration knew that the COVID jabs didn't work. We're going to talk about the Maui wildfires as well. What was really going on? Or should climate change be blamed for the Maui wildfires? We're going to get into this and more on this first edition of the Carl Jackson Show. Our guest, Marc Murano of ClimateDepot.com, is going to be joining us. He's also author of the book, The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. Don't let the left take away your freedom. They're going to use climate next to try and do that, because they're almost done with COVID, all right? We'll be talking about that and more in this edition of the Carl Jackson Show. All right, welcome to the debut of the Carl Jackson Show on the Salem News Channel. We've got a bang-up show for you today. Obviously, there's been a lot going on in the news this week. You have this judge that has gone after Trump that has said, hey, listen, we're going to have hearings for Trump literally the day before Super Tuesday. All types of crazy news out there. But there is a big story that is out there with Maui that I want to get into. What I'm going to be doing every single week is bringing you the biggest stories out there where the left is trying to encroach on your constitutional principles or on constitutional principles, individual liberties, and where I believe they're trying to destroy the middle class. So what we're going to do weekly on the Carl Jackson Show is take huge topics that are infringing on your individual liberties, and we are going to knock them down, both with research, with experts on the right, because we need to fight back against the totalitarian left. So joining me today, I am honored and privileged to have Marc Murano. He is the publisher of ClimateDepot.com, also author of The Great Reset, Global Elites, and The Permanent Lockdown. Marc, welcome to the Carl Jackson Show. I'm so privileged that you're here with me on the first program.
Well, thank you, Carl. Happy to be here. A lot to talk about. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot to talk about. Marc, listen, I almost don't know where to start because there is so much to talk about. I want to get to Maui shortly because I do believe, I believe that it's ground zero, if you will, for the Great Reset. I believe there's an experiment going on there, Marc. I don't want to get conspiratorial, but I believe there's something fishy going on. But first off, let me start here, Marc. I got this Wall Street Journal article in front of me, and the question is, hottest days ever? ? Don't believe it. Marc, we've been told by the left that we have endured the hottest summer ever, the hottest summer in 125,000 years. So I think the first thing that I'd like to take on, or like for you to take on, is this issue of quote unquote man-made climate change. How is it that they know how hot it was 125,000 years ago, Marc Murano?
Well, this is weaponizing weather, and this was pre-planned. They're not even talking about a hottest year. They're not even talking, in many cases, about a hottest month. They're trying to pick out, it was July 4th as the hottest day in 125,000 years. Turns out, depending on what data set, it may have been the hottest since 1979. So, that was a year before CNN went on. That's a single day. Now, if a climate skeptic would point out a blizzard or a record cold day in the winter, oh, well, weather is not climate. You got to look at timescales. If you look at timescales 30, 50, 100 years, let's do that for a second. They were claiming that the United States was having record heat. If you look at the database, and even Biden's EPA has this chart, it's about 10 times worse EPA heat index in the 1930s, 1936 being way hotter. In other words, state all-time temperature records, 75% were set before 1955. The 1930s were the hottest decade on record in the United States. Regardless of what happened this summer, it was not as hot. Now, they can look at Phoenix. And by the way, you know when Phoenix last had their record that was just broken this summer? Was in June of 1974. You know what was happening in June of 1974? That's when it was the last time it was this hot in Phoenix. It was during the man-made global cooling scare. It was literally the same week Time magazine had articles about the coming ice age, and no one was talking about the heat in Phoenix being, well, this is proof of the ice age. It didn't happen because it didn't make sense in the narrative. A heat wave now does. So it's important to note, 80% of our man-made CO2 came after 1940, pretty much World War II and after. So for the 1930s to be as hot as they were in the United States, with all the temperature records still standing, state high temperature records, 75% set before 1955, you have to look and say, maybe this isn't man-made climate related. And it's not. If you look at the first this is an important point, the first United Nations climate report, 1990, it shows the medieval warm period as much warmer than today. Now, what happened? We had it when I was working in the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. We had a scientist come in and testify that other scientists affiliated with the United Nations had an email chain basically saying we have to get rid of the medieval warm period because it was inconvenient data. So by 2001, the UN comes out with a new chart called the hockey stick, completely erased the medieval warm period. This is how they do work. What I referenced to you about Biden's EPA chart in 1930 showing the heat wave index 10 times worse, there's now a scientist in Texas A&M University named Andrew Dessler who literally is saying we have to get rid of the EPA 1930s heat wave chart because it's so inconvenient to the narrative. And it's the same impulse we saw when the Barrington Declaration, or all the scientists and the Nobel Prize winning chemists who came out against lockdowns and vaccine and mask mandates, school closures, they literally said, we have to get rid of them. We're going to label them fringe epidemiologists. That's what Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins and our top government leaders did. And that's what they set about to do. So the same thing happens not only with scientists in the climate world, but also with the data. It literally just gets massaged, erased, and altered so that if it's inconvenient, it's gone.
Mark, listen, Mark, I'm speaking to Marc Murano. Again, check out his website, climatedepot.com. Also get his book, The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. I'm going to get to that shortly because I do believe that that's where we're headed. I do believe that's what we're seeing in Maui as well. But first, I want to get to this. If you go to Climate Depot, climatedepot.com, right on the top, Mark, here's the headline: Shock Retraction of Climate Science.
Yes.
Papers showing no climate emergencies, draws comparisons with Climate Gate scandal. And I think this is so important for us to touch on, Mark, because I got to tell you, I don't even see Republicans fighting on this issue. And it drives me insane because obviously where the left wants to take this is they want power and they will use everything, whether it's COVID lockdowns, whether it's an impending climate lockdown, in order to gain power over us.
They will. And that paper you just mentioned, by the way, was a peer-reviewed journal on science, basically saying that the climate fears overblown. Climate skeptics were excited to present this paper. And immediately the editor was under such pressure. We saw this with the ClimateGate scandal back in 2009, 2010. Journal editors would be threatened by top UN officials and scientists if they published a paper that went against the narrative. The science be damned. It didn't matter. So that's what happened in this paper. Immediately, the editor of the paper was under fire. He had to put a disclaimer. And then there was a whole campaign to get the paper removed or retracted, or some kind of notation put on that the paper's been retracted. And this was written about before it happened. Roger Pilkey Jr., University of Colorado, did a whole expose from a whistleblower saying there's a whole movement just to remove the paper. This is exactly what we saw during COVID. I'll give you an example. It's very similar. New England Journal of Medicine in April of 2020, right when this thing breaks, does a study talking about how mask mandates don't work even in hospitals. And they go on and say it may make you feel better, but it has no impact on a virus. It does nothing. Within 2 or 3 weeks of that paper, they had to essentially retract it. All the authors had to put disclaimers. The journal had to do it. It's that same thing. You can't be wrong on the science if you're with the narrative. In other words, you'll never, no matter how wrong you are, and we saw COVID and climate, they can be wrong on everything. But if it's with the right goal and what the political leaders want, you'll never be questioned. If you have all the science on your side, but you're against the political leaders, you will be destroyed, retracted, dissembled. And we saw it in COVID. It's easy to create a consensus when you literally cancel, defund, and censor the scientists who dissent.
Mark, we have just a couple of minutes before our first before our first break here. Are you concerned that the Biden administration will use a climate emergency to try and do essentially what they did with COVID, with the lockdowns?
Well, this is the heart of everything that we're dealing with right now. Okay, March of 2020. Unfortunately, Donald Trump signs the COVID declaration. And unfortunately, we have the 10 days to flatten the curve, which we now know, according to Deborah Birx, was a complete lie. Donald Trump was duped by Anthony Fauci, by the public health. They knew it wasn't going to be 10 days. They were just conning them. They were conning the American public. You can watch the video where they're both smiling at each other, Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx. So my point in bringing that up when you mentioned the question is that was the moment that the entire Western world changed overnight. Wow. Because the once free West became overnight a carbon copy of one party rule China. No longer did we need any ounce of stinking democracy to close churches, close schools, vaccine mandates, cancel weddings, funerals, stay at home orders by governors, all sorts of limitations on your travel, all without a single ounce of democracy. That declaration empowered governors, mayors to be dictators overnight. Now, the climate activists were at first jealous, and I did whole special reports on this. It's in my book, The Great Reset. You had climate activists like Teen Vogue activists saying, if we can shut down the world for a virus, we can do the same thing for climate. You had the UK Guardian saying we need lockdowns after COVID's over for the climate. We need to lock down the world again to save the planet. So then they were praising the lockdowns, how good they were for the health of the air, for the planet, for species, for the environment. Okay, so that happens. Environmentalists are first jealous, and then they want in. So there's been a concerted campaign within 2 months of that. So again, March 2020, we have the COVID emergency declaration. And by the way, my book goes through back to the Roman Empire, Roman Republic, descent into an empire throughout the Middle Ages, 1930s Germany. The greatest abuses of human rights have come during government emergency declarations. So you can see where we're headed with this. Let's look at 9/11. We're still living under the 9/11 emergency declaration. George W. Bush signed that in September 2001. It sounded like a good idea at the time, but that gave us domestic surveillance that allowed the Biden administration just the last couple of years to declare angry parents at school board meetings, domestic terrorists. It gave us things like help to facilitate the Patriot Act, all of this big government surveillance and massive infringement on civil liberties. We're still living under that 9/11 declaration, and it could go on for another 100 years. And believe me, it's not like a tornado or a disaster area emergency declaration. If Biden declares a climate emergency, there's no end date to that. There's no criteria and by which they're going to say, well, the climate crisis is solved. We're going to lift this emergency decree. It would never happen. And here's what happened. So just go back to March of 2020. That set off every governor, mayor, and president, prime minister could be a dictator. This is how Joe Biden had the mask mandates on airplanes, how they did the vax mandates in every city. Remember, no vote by anyone of any of this. There was no legislator, there's no parliament, no supervisor. It was all just done by unelected bureaucrats and power-hungry politicians using these emergency powers. So where we are now is, sorry about the dogs there, but where we are now is Joe Biden is set to declare a national climate emergency based on the same template that we saw with COVID. The Center for Biological Diversity is saying that this will give Joe Biden 130 new executive powers by which to rule. Now, this could mean everything from thermostat controls to regulations on agriculture. We already have John Kerry wanting to limit high yield agriculture, fertilizer. It could bring in restrictions on our methane. It could help ban the gas-powered cars, give governors, mayors more power to just say, we're not even going to allow gas-powered cars to be sold. We already know the Joe Biden administration just a month ago is merging with Health and Human Services. They're merging COVID and not public health and climate change. So they want to start naming heat waves. And this is all, again, done through executive action. This would accelerate under a climate emergency. And the idea would be that name the heat waves, come up with death tolls from every heat wave, and then you're going to have a climate death count. We have in Canada, under this scenario, the doctor, for the first time ever, 2001, diagnosed a patient as clinically suffering from climate change, wrote it on his chart.
Oh my God.
And then we have academics at a peer-reviewed journal in Australia who want to add climate change as a cause of death to your death certificate. This is all coming up with climate and COVID, climate death counts a la COVID.
All right, Mark. So listen, I literally just tweeted this out yesterday. I said that you will not see climate change on a death certificate. Lo and behold, 24 hours, I just found out that I'm absolutely wrong. But this is where what I fear. Mark, let me ask you this, Mark. Where the heck are the Republicans? Where is the conservative movement on this issue? There's so much evidence out there. If you go to climatedepot.com that you can read and find out this is a hoax.
Yeah, I mean, it's so overwhelming, the evidence, that I'm just going to say this. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the man who wanted to jail climate deniers, climate skeptics, CEOs of energy companies, is now telling people in his campaign that he will not be talking about climate change because it has been hijacked for totalitarian control by the World Economic Forum and the United Nations. One of the most strident activists has walked away from the climate narrative. And he's not the only one. People like Michael Schellenberg, who was a Marxist, original author of the Green New Deal, is now one of the greatest climate skeptics out there today. Steve Koonin, a physicist who worked for the Obama administration energy department, now a leading climate skeptic today. So the evidence is overwhelming. And even if you believe in climate change, whatever that means, the idea that you should have, the idea that you should not be 100% opposed to the climate agenda is what's shocking. You asked me where the Republicans are. The Republicans are in a dark, dismal place. Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy. Let me talk about Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader. Yay, the Republicans are in charge. Ask Kevin McCarthy what he thinks about climate change, Carl. You know what he says? Climate change is the problem. Republicans have solutions. We're going to be planting trees and we're going to capture carbon under the ground. We're going to spend billions of dollars giving it to it's the Republican version of the Obama and Biden green stimulus. We're going to give it to these companies to grab CO2, pipe it underground, and have it so that they can literally bury CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a complete boondoggle, waste of money, will have no effect on atmospheric CO2. In some cases, what the Republicans are proposing would actually create more CO2 emissions than they would save by burying the CO2. And what's interesting about this is that the Republican leadership, to a person, will not challenge climate change. They want to say that they believe it's a problem. And not only that, Carl, are you ready for this? Fox News has been infected. That debate you saw with the Republicans, Martha McCallum.
Yes.
The climate activists from the GOP had bragged a week before that they were working with the GOP, with Fox News on this. These are young Republicans who were grown up since kindergarten to find out that they believe climate is a serious threat. They've been propagandized. They went to Fox News. They were advising them. So Martha McCallum asks the Republican candidates to show of hands. She uses Hawaii wildfires as proof. She uses an ocean temperature of 101, which even NBC News debunked that, by the way. NBC News pointed out that it was a one temperature buoy off of coast of Florida in shallow, murky water that wasn't even the hottest in 6 years. And NBC News quoted a meteorologist on the site saying this shouldn't be used for anything because this is a weird anomaly in the water. But that went global. Ocean temperatures are hot tub temperatures now. And Fox News used it. They had no preparation. And one meteorologist said Fox News corporate, the news side, again, not the opinion shows, is equivalent to the UK Guardian's climate view now. So it's infecting all of corporate America. It's infected Wall Street. It's infecting Republican leadership. Now, there's a few Republican candidates. Ron DeSantis, probably great on the climate agenda. I don't know what he'd probably waffle on climate science. Vivek Ramaswamy is probably the best, but he even waffles a little. Donald Trump's very good, but Donald Trump, when he was president, allowed Larry Kudlow to scuttle the first ever pushback against the United Nations. They were going to set up a climate commission of about 24 top scientists And
Unbelievable.
Larry Kudlow,
Unbelievable.
they yesed Donald Trump. They told him it was going to happen. It didn't happen. They kept postponing it. And at one point, Trump tells scientists, I thought I approved that. And Larry Kudlow now publicly brags to people that he killed that climate commission because it was been bad optics. And essentially, Republicans didn't want to deal with that nasty, thorny issue. So Donald Trump missed that major opportunity. Again, it was who he surrounded himself with. But Donald Trump, Vivek Ramaswamy are probably the two best of the candidates running on climate.
I gotta tell you, and we were talking about this before, Mark, and this is why DeSantis has to be unleashed. I think it's a good thing that some people are abandoning, some donors are abandoning him. He's actually good when it comes to this issue, but he's got to speak out on it. And I say that for the entire Republican Party. I believe that if the Republican Party does not speak out against this issue of man-made climate change, we used to call it photosynthesis, Mark. That's what we used to call it. All right. So if the Republicans don't start speaking out against this stuff, they're going to continue to open the doors for left-wing radicals to win election after election after elections, because the left has managed to make this a moral issue.
Yes.
They get people scared, they get people angry, and they get their votes. So the Republican Party either needs to end this or nip it in the bud now, or risk losing elections. And it looks to me, based on what you're saying, they're ready to go along to get along with this issue. But that's going to mean a lot of losses in the future, in my opinion, Mark, for the Republican Party.
Okay, yes, good point. Nikki Haley gave the standard Republican response to climate at that debate. They're terrified of it. They accept the premise, and they want to have basically their version of the Green New Deal light. We're going to plant trees, and we're going to pursue all of the above, which is fine, all of the above, and carbon capture. But if you look back, Mitt Romney, McCain, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Bob Dole, all of them would never challenge the climate science. Donald Trump was an anomaly among Republicans. And one of the reasons I think he swept that whole entire establishment in 2016 was because of these kind of views. And I think right now, as we go forward, we only have a few candidates, maybe DeSantis, Vivek, and Trump, out of all the candidates running. But even Trump, again, was undermined by his own staff on this. But Republicans have got to fight this issue. And unfortunately, I was at the UN climate summit in Egypt last November. Republicans sent a whole delegation of congressmen. Not a nary a one challenged it. They just went to talk about the importance of keeping fossil fuels around longer. I mean, they're completely clueless. They're negotiating with our people who are trying out to destroy us.
I know there's a lot of big issues, a lot of big topics that have hit the news this week, but there are major topics that are hitting that I believe the left wants you to ignore, forget about, or what have you, that are essentially going to take away your individual liberties. All right. I'm a Bill of Rights guy. I look at the macro oftentimes, and I look at these issues where the left uses particular issues such as climate change, like we're talking about, in order to take more power away from we the people. And they're doing just that with climate change. We've seen what they were willing to do with the COVID lockdowns, despite evidence to this day that everything, literally everything they did not work. The social distancing, the jabs, the mask, none of it worked. Yet and still, you have a White House and an administration that is willing to lock down the country again or recommend that people get jabs. But more importantly, this climate thing is becoming the new COVID. And that's what we've been talking about with Marc Murano. And again, make sure you go out and get his book, The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. Also, check out his website, climatedepot.com. Search that thing daily. Make sure you don't fall prey to the radical left on this issue, as well as weak-kneed Republicans. We were talking about the weak-kneed Republicans before we went to the last break, Mark.
Yes, and the Republican Party's always been bad on this. I mean, Mitt Romney was support, had a lot of Obama's EPA people with him. John McCain had co-sponsored climate bills. George W. Bush rubber-stamped every UN treaty and never challenged the climate narrative for a second. George H.W. Bush got us into the whole mess at the Rio Earth Summit 1992 by signing that, started the whole UN climate treaty process. So Republican presidents have been the worst, except for Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, it really wasn't a big issue at all back in the 80s. At that time, we were just coming out of the global cooling scare when Ronald Reagan was elected. So what the Republican Party and where we're going forward on this whole issue right now is we need Republicans to stand up and challenge the narrative. We saw the same thing with COVID. Where was Republican leadership on mask mandates, vaccine mandates, lockdowns? They were all just basically silent. In fact, here's the most frightening part, Carl. Nothing has changed since COVID essentially ended before. There's no reform of emergency powers. There's no restrictions now on future mask mandates, vax mandates, school closures, church closures. The only state in all 50 states, again, Ron DeSantis belongs in the governor's hall of fame, is Florida, that has put these kind of restrictions in and made it so it's almost impossible for the next governor, next administration, future to ever do this again. Unfortunately, we're all sitting ducks waiting for the next scare and them to reimpose all of this. Now, you mentioned Hawaii in your opening. Very important to talk about. The governor there is Josh Green in Hawaii. They have been bragging for years, and they were the first state of all 50 states to go net zero for climate. And what did that mean? It meant that despite being warned multiple times in 2018, 2019 about the overgrowth in their forests, about the poor management and needed upgrades for their power grid and the power cables, they didn't spend that money. Instead, they spent it all on green infrastructure, green stimulus, green energy. All of that went to waste. So then we have a massive fire. They don't have water for the fire because the man in charge is worried about water equity. They don't allow the sirens to go because the person running the sirens thinks the public will be too stupid. The public authorities in charge tell people, go this way, don't go that way. The people who listened to the government authorities mostly died. The people who went against their advice actually mostly lived. And this is according to the Associated Press, not Alex Jones. And what's interesting is they had already declared a housing emergency before this even happened. And this was going to be one of the sort of 15-minute city shining examples, Hawaii. They're very progressive. So all this was in the works before the fire. Now the fire happens and you have equity asset firms ringing up all the residents. You have landlords now evicting people whose homes didn't burn. You have the governor on TV publicly announcing that he wants the government to buy up the land and maybe turn it into a memorial and monuments or wildlife preserve or something for the victims. And then he has to back away from that a couple days later when there's outcry. You have Hawaii residents sounding very conspiratorial, saying what is going on here. And you have all the wealthy residents from Barack Obama to Michelle Obama to Oprah Winfrey, and to Mark Zuckerberg. None of their property was affected, and you have to start wondering: is this and there was also this idea that Hawaii was going to be this wealthy enclave, the Maui, for just people, for all these billionaires to telecommute and be based in. And this actually helps accelerate that. You got rid of all the low-cost housing. You get rid of any middle class. And now they can rebuild in their image. We'll see where this goes. The public is watching. They may not get away with it here, but it's just asks a lot of questions that I don't necessarily have all the answers to, but something is up in Hawaii.
I definitely think it's incumbent upon people like myself and you, Mark, to make sure to the best of our ability that we keep focusing on Maui. I really think this is ground zero for the Great Reset. I mean, as you were basically...
Well, remember, Build Back Better. And that's the lockdowns collapsed. The lockdowns were a controlled demolition of our economy. The Maui fires were a controlled demolition of the working and middle class of what was left in Maui. And now they want to build back better. What does build back better look like? It looks like global elites telling you every aspect of your life, because if you're left to they believe that we, the unwashed masses, Carl, if we're left to our own devices, we'll create racism, inequity, environmental destruction, a climate crisis, and we need to be managed. Every aspect of our life, to whether what kind of ceiling fans, to our gas stove, to pizza ovens, to what kind of car, to whether we can eat meat, to whether Mayor Bloomberg in New York, not making this up, with corporate backing, IKEA, Google, had a report out called the C40 report of 40.
Well aware of it.
3 new pair of clothes per person per year by 2030 because of the carbon footprint.
3 pieces of clothing.
They're literally talking about regulating how many clothes you can buy.
3 pieces of clothing, if I'm not mistaken, per year.
Yes, per person per year. That's in the report. I have screenshots. This is a major corporate report. Again, we don't need secret documents, anonymous sources. I'm not blowing up some little obscure blog making everything I've told you today is from mainstream sources, from corporate media, from major organizations like the United Nations or the World Economic Forum, and they're coming for our control this way. MasterCard and the United Nations have a new card out called Dichotomy. It monitors your carbon footprint and cuts off your ability to spend when you hit your carbon max. That is basically where they're headed to with central bank digital currency, where the Bank of England said the quiet part out loud. Central bank digital currency will mean governments only allow you to spend on what government deems sensible. So if that does not going to include gas for your gas-powered car, a hamburger, you see the level of control that we're headed for, and it's all to keep us safe. That's why they loved COVID so much, because they were able to use fear for the first time in our modern life. In our lifetime, Carl, we've never experienced that kind of, well, other than 9/11, that kind of a fear campaign, but I think it was more effective than 9/11, much more effective, because this was going after your grandma and your children and affected you. That this kind of fear in order to have absolute control, and that's where they want to now go with the climate, and that's why they're using every weather event. And by the way, just key point: hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, wildfires, droughts on declining or no trend on climate timescales, 30, 50, 100 years. Even the United Nations admits that, buried in their reports. So there is no climate emergency. There is no reason to declare a climate declaration. There was no COVID emergency. There was no reason to declare a COVID national emergency. Again, devastating. And, and I think we should be working to repeal the 9/11 emergency declaration from 2001. This is our lives at stake, and Republicans this isn't even on their radar. And sad, I don't even think it's on Donald Trump, whose radar it's on the most, and this may shock people, is RFK Jr., but he's got a whole host of other problems, but he's dead right when it comes to COVID, emergency declarations, free speech. Those are his issues, and those are what he's running on. So if you listen to him, his main messages, he's fantastic. He has a lot of problems, though, on a lot of other issues, guns. And
it is so disconcerting that the person that's speaking loudly about this happens to be a Democrat and on the left. And by the way, he had completely different views at one period of time, but he's willing to admit that this movement basically has been co-opted. Again, I mean, these people want to ration your gas, your electricity, your meat. Just pay attention to Maui. Please go look at the citizen journalists. Yes. The people that survived were the people that ignored the government. Marc Murano, listen, we have less than a minute left, but I do want you to talk to people about your book. I want you to talk to people about climatedepot.com and the time remaining here.
Yes, I'm a former staff at the United States Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I had been red pilled now by what happened in March of 2020 with COVID. So I wrote a book called The Great Reset: Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown, where I literally lay out how this came about. It used to be called things like the New World Order, but essentially it goes back to Woodrow Wilson. And the idea is they don't believe average people can control their lives. And this whole idea of we're ruled by expert. Remember, we have to do what the experts say. That's what my book's about. And I think it shows how we're becoming more and more like one party rule China, because under emergency decrees, COVID, climate, terrorism, we don't get to make these choices. Unelected bureaucrats do. Thank you.
All right. Marc Murano, climatedepot.com. Go get his book, The Great Reset. Thanks for joining us, Marc. Guys, the reason why I've been talking to you about this stuff is because I'm one of these guys. I tend to look at things on a macro level, and then I try to figure out the details. I try to see where the left is coming. I'm a guy that subscribes to biblical values, constitutional principles, individual liberty, and the middle class. I do not want to see the middle class hollowed out even further than we've already been. And that has been the modus operandi. That has been the goal and the mission of the left. They want a society of have and have nots. They want a society where the authoritarians rule and we just have to shut up and take it. And so we have to fight back against some of these major issues. And we have to make sure that our candidates are sticking up for us. I'm sorry, but when you see a Trump or DeSantis, big names that are in this race, they need to be speaking out on this issue. It is a freedom issue, this issue of man-made climate change, or the hoax of man-made climate change. We need to be talking about this more. We need to be talking about this often. We need to be talking about this frequently because it has been co-opted by the left. Here's what I would like to do. You have this guy in Hawaii, this governor of Hawaii, Josh Green is his name, that said ultimately climate change was to blame for the Maui wildfires. The guy is a complete and utter liar. What the fire did was expose the plans of the Great Reset, basically, that they were trying to impose on the island of Maui. You heard Marc Murano talk about it. That was basically a case study. Lahaina was, Maui was. That was what was going on. And again, I'll just reiterate some of the details before we close out. But before we do, I want you to hear John Kerry. John Kerry, who always looks and sounds like he has Grey Poupon sitting in his back pocket, ready to pass it out. Here's what he has to say about people like you and I that understand that the left is absolutely using the issue of climate change to empower and embolden themselves. Let's listen to this guy share his scare tactics.
Without facts or economics on their side, they flatly deny what is happening to our planet and what we must do to save it. They incite a movement against what they falsely label climate change fanaticism, as they conveniently forget that the dictionary definition of a cult is the dismissal of facts in devotion to a lie. And while they refuse to accept the facts behind increasingly obvious damages, which the First Minister listed, they lash out at the truth tellers instead and label indisputable evidence as hysteria. They compound the already difficult challenge of the climate crisis by promising to do more of exactly what created this crisis in the first place. So now, humanity is inexorably threatened by humanity itself, by those seducing people into buying into a completely fictitious alternative reality where we don't need to act and we don't even need to care.
This guy's a complete and utter liar. Wherever he's giving that speech, I doubt very seriously that he's going to be leaving on a bicycle. This is a guy that has massive mansions. This is a guy that flies on a private jet to and fro. And when he was finally questioned on his private jet usage by Congress, well, I don't own it. My wife owns it. All right. This is a guy that married a rich woman. But he is absolutely lying. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that man-made climate change is not a big deal. It is not an existential threat at all. The way that these people hype it up, it is completely a hoax, and it's okay to say that, and we've got to say that. Listen, there was a Wall Street Journal article, again, the hottest days ever. We spoke about this briefly with Marc Murano. The left is claiming, people like John Kerry, that we experienced the hottest July 4th or 3rd in 125,000 years. The problem with that claim, the temperature was derived from the University of Maine's climate reanalyzer, which relies on a mix of satellite temperature data and computer model guesstimation to calculate the estimates of the temperature. What's the problem with that? There was no satellite data 125,000 years ago. This is the left's goal is to get rid of fossil fuel vehicles. The left's goal is to get us into EVs that I'll be talking about shortly here. And the left's goal is to make sure that government absolutely runs everything. What happened in Maui had nothing to do with ultimately with man-made climate change, as that ridiculous governor Josh Green said, had absolutely nothing to do with it. Again, there were several issues that played a part, hat tip Breitbart, in that Maui wildfire. For one, the local power company did not shut off power before the fires. And by the way, there is a lawsuit between, I think the government there, the local government is suing Hawaiian Electric. And Hawaiian Electric is saying, hey, listen, this is the fire. The wildfires are the firefighters' fault. So blame is flying everywhere. Hawaiian Electric is saying, listen, you guys claim to have sustained the fire, except you didn't sustain the fire after a pole, an electric pole initially broke, sparking the first fire. All right. So they went several hours. where allegedly the fire was contained, but unfortunately they did not do that. So you had 7 things that occurred in Maui. It had nothing to do with climate change. Again, local power company did not shut off the power before the fires. This is despite the fact that they were warned that high winds were coming. They were experiencing high winds before. Lahaina residents were not preemptively evacuated as they should have been. And so the alarms were not sounded the way that they typically are. You have Maui authorities that ignored the non-native grass issues for several years. You have non-native grass that's there that's highly flammable, highly combustible. They used to have pineapple fields and sugarcane fields that where they were growing those edibles there. And that they're no longer growing there. You have all these non-native grasses that have popped up. You have firefighters that, again, left the Lahaina fire too early. Officials called it 100% contained when it was not. They didn't do what's called mop up. Mop up is essentially difficult because you have dirty and because it's dirty and it lacks the excitement, but it's a critical phase of suppressing fires because remaining burning debris may rekindle. This is a training manual for the National Wildfire Coordination Group says mop up must be thorough because a small spark or flame could rekindle, starting another and perhaps larger fire. And then you have the emergency sirens that were never sounded to warn the Lahaina residents. The release of the water to fight the fires was delayed. The key exit route out of Lahaina was barricaded. There are several factors that led to the deaths of God knows how many people. We have just over 110 bodies that have been discovered, but there is still hundreds and hundreds of people that are missing in Maui. And what was happening there? It is full government control. So many of these residents of Lahaina trusted their government instead of their instincts. There's story after story after story of the people that trusted their instincts over government that survived, and many that did not survive those fires. But that is just where we are. There's more headlines. I told you that they want to get you into EVs. Well, did you know that China has massive electrical vehicle graveyards right now? These things are actually sullying or dirtying the environment. They're not good. They're made from fossil fuels. The batteries of EVs rely on cobalt, an estimated 70% of global supply of cobalt. Cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they have child slave labor. This stuff is absolute nonsense. EVs are powered by fossil fuels. I could go on and on and on. But ultimately, what the left wants to do, they want to enslave you. They want to impose the same type of lockdowns that they imposed on us for COVID. And remember, with COVID, they now know that virtually everything they did was a lie. It was wrong. Mass prevent COVID transmission. We knew that was a lie. That we were told that the jabs would slow the spread or stop the spread in some cases. That was a lie. We were told that natural immunity didn't work. That was a lie. We have emails. I've got a headline here. Emails showed that the Biden administration knew that the vaccines didn't stop COVID as early as January 2021, and yet they forced these mandates down our throats anyway. Guys, we cannot fall for the next lockdown, and it will be a climate lockdown. The Biden administration and the left wants to invoke a climate emergency in order to take away more powers from you. And I ask you the question, where the heck is the Republican Party? Where the heck is the conservative movement? We are going to have a lot of breaking stories, obviously, in this election cycle, and obviously with the persecution of Donald Trump. But don't get distracted enough where you don't look at what the left is trying to do to you to take away your freedoms. Every week, we are going to be talking about this. This is the Carl Jackson Show. I'm so glad that you joined me for the debut of the program. Remember, biblical values, constitutional principles, individual liberties, and we are going to save the middle class right here on the Carl Jackson Show on the Salem News Channel every week. I'll see you next time. Don't grow weary doing good.